The bronze casket. The Delacroix mansion stood like a pale sentinel against Palm Beach's turquoise horizon, its white columns and manicured gardens masking the peculiar arrangement within. For 3 years, Vincent Delacroix had kept his wife Eleanor's embalmed body in a custom bronze casket in the East Wing's solarium, where morning light would dance across the polished metal surface, just as she had once loved to bask in the sunrise. The casket, an ornate masterpiece of craftsmanship, had cost more than most Palm Beach homes, its surface etched with delicate vines and blooming roses, Eleanor's favorite flower. "She belongs here, where she was happiest," Vincent would insist, whenever Eleanor's sister Margaret raised objections, which had become increasingly frequent and heated. This was our agreement. This was her wish. His voice would always soften when speaking of Eleanor, his fingers tracing the bronze patterns as if touching his wife's skin. Margaret Henderson knew better. Her sister had been traditional to a fault, had spoken explicitly about being laid to rest in the family plot beside their parents in Evergreen Cemetery. The sisters had even purchased matching plots during their mother's funeral 7 years ago. Vincent's grief had transformed into something unnatural, an obsession that kept Eleanor suspended between worlds, a possession that Margaret could no longer tolerate. "It's morbid and illegal," Margaret argued during their last heated exchange in the mansion's grand library, surrounded by first editions that neither of them noticed anymore. "She deserves proper burial, Vincent. This isn't love, it's possession. You've turned her into an object." Margaret's voice had risen until it echoed off the vaulted ceiling, her normally composed demeanor cracking under years of accumulated distress. Vincent's response was always the same, a cold stare that hardened his otherwise handsome features, followed by a silent gesture to Harding, the butler who had served the Delacroix family for 3 generations, who would escort her to the door with practiced discretion. "Mrs. Henderson will be leaving now," Vincent would say, turning back to his brandy and the portrait of Eleanor that dominated the room. After exhausting legal channels, the prenuptial agreement giving Vincent unusual latitude in final arrangements, and her lawyers warning her about breaking and entering charges, Margaret found herself in a dimly lit bar in West Palm Beach, across from 2 men whose appearances suggested familiarity with tasks requiring discretion rather than ethics. Mick was tall and wiry, with tattoos peeking from beneath his collar, while Cal was shorter, stockier, with calloused hands that spoke of years of manual labor before he'd found more profitable ventures. "5,000 now, 5 when it's done," she said, sliding an envelope across the sticky table, her manicured nails a stark contrast to the establishment's grime. "The alarm code is 4729. My sister needs to be moved to Evergreen Cemetery. I have the plot ready and a funeral director on standby who won't ask questions." Mick, the taller of the 2, pocketed the envelope without counting. His eyes, sharp and assessing, never left Margaret's face. "What about the casket?" "Leave it. Just bring Eleanor. It's too heavy and too recognizable." Margaret's voice was steady, but her trembling hands betrayed her nerves as she sipped her untouched gin and tonic. "Lady, you sure about this?" asked Cal, his voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes and cheap whiskey. "Rich people got ways of making problems for folks like us, and there's laws about moving bodies." He leaned forward, the overhead light casting shadows that deepened the lines on his weathered face. "He'll be in Miami until Thursday for an art auction. You have a 2-day window." Margaret ignored his question, instead pushing a hand-drawn map across the table. "The solarium is here. Eleanor is inside. No staff will be present after 10 p.m. Vincent gives them Wednesday nights off." 2 nights later, the pair slipped onto the grounds through a service entrance that had been left conveniently unlocked, just as Margaret had promised. They disabled the security system with the code, moving with practiced efficiency, despite the unusual nature of their task. The mansion's interior was a showcase of wealth: marble floors from Italian quarries, antique furniture that museums would covet, artwork worth more than either man would see in a lifetime of their usual jobs. "East Wing," whispered Mick, consulting the crude map Margaret had drawn on expensive stationery with the Delacroix monogram. past the main staircase, second hallway on the right. They moved like shadows through the silent house, their footsteps muffled by Persian rugs that had once graced royal palaces. Every corner revealed new extravagances, crystal chandeliers that cast prismatic shadows, tapestries depicting mythological scenes, sculptures that seemed to watch their progress with empty eyes. The solarium was exactly where she'd described, its glass ceiling revealing a canopy of stars, undiminished by Palm Beach's lights, a feat of engineering that had cost Vincent a small fortune in specialized glass. But what they found inside wasn't what they'd expected. There was no bronze casket. Instead, Eleanor Delacroix sat in perfect, preserved posture on a velvet chaise lounge, dressed in a flowing blue gown that matched her vacant eyes. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elegant updo, adorned with pearl pins that caught the moonlight. The embalming had been masterful. She appeared almost alive, frozen in contemplation of the garden visible through the windows. A book lay open on her lap, positioned as if she had just paused in her reading to watch the night blooming flowers in the garden beyond. Jesus Christ, Cal muttered, crossing himself instinctively, taking an involuntary step backward. Nobody said anything about this. He gestured vaguely at Eleanor's displayed body, his usual composure shaken. Let's get this over with, Mick replied, unfolding the body bag they'd brought, his face betraying no emotion, though his movements had become stiffer, more mechanical. Rich people are all kinds of crazy. They worked quickly, trying to ignore the uncanny sensation of moving what appeared to be a sleeping woman. Eleanor's body was surprisingly light, her limbs flexible in a way that suggested specialized preservation techniques far beyond standard embalming. Her skin felt like cool silk beneath their gloved hands, unnervingly lifelike despite the absence of warmth. Careful with her hair, Mick cautioned as they eased her into the bag. Her sister will want her looking proper for burial. There was something almost tender in how they zipped the bag, a respect neither man had anticipated feeling for their macabre cargo. As they carried her through the garden's back gate where their nondescript van waited, Cal stumbled on a loose stone in the path. Sorry, he whispered, as if Eleanor might hear him, might take offense at the jostling. The drive to Evergreen Cemetery was tense, both men unusually silent. Twice they thought they were being followed, but the late hour meant few cars shared the roads with them. The cemetery gates had been left unlocked as promised. The caretaker's cottage dark, except for a single window where a silhouette waited. By dawn, they delivered Eleanor to Margaret at Evergreen Cemetery, where a private service was hastily arranged. The cemetery caretaker, an old friend of Margaret's from college days, asked no questions as they lowered Eleanor into the ground beside her parents. The simple ceremony felt incongruous after the ornate display in Vincent's solarium. Just Margaret, the caretaker, a hastily summoned priest who believed he was performing a delayed service for a recently deceased woman, and the two men who stood awkwardly at a distance, unwilling to leave until they received their final payment. She's at peace now, Margaret sighed, watching the first shovelful of earth fall onto the simple wooden casket she'd chosen. Tears streamed down her face, but whether from grief or relief, even she couldn't have said. This is what she wanted, Vincent's claims notwithstanding. The priest murmured final prayers, his breath visible in the dawn chill. Margaret pressed an envelope into Mick's hand without looking at him. I'd appreciate your discretion, permanently, she said quietly. Lady, we were never here, Cal responded, already backing toward their van. Never saw nothing, never moved nobody. Vincent returned to Palm Beach earlier than expected, sensing something amiss when his customary evening call to check the security system went unanswered. The security company had called about a system reset that wasn't scheduled. He cut short his Miami trip, canceling meetings with art dealers and collectors without explanation, driving through the night with a growing sense of dread that tightened his chest and whitened his knuckles on the steering wheel. He rushed to the solarium, not bothering to turn on lights as he navigated the familiar hallways of his mansion. The door was unlocked, Another sign something was wrong. He burst inside, moonlight illuminating the empty chaise where Eleanor had been positioned in her eternal repose. His howl of rage echoed through the empty mansion, a primal sound of loss and fury that sent the household staff scurrying to the far wings, exchanging frightened glances, but no words. They had long ago learned not to question the master's grief or his methods of managing it. Within hours, he'd assembled a team of private investigators, former police detectives, willing to work without asking too many questions, when the retainer included enough zeros. Within days, they'd traced the body to Evergreen Cemetery through a groundskeeper who'd mentioned the unusual night burial to a drinking buddy who happened to be on Vincent's payroll. Vincent arrived with police and court orders demanding exhumation. His influence with local officials, cultivated through years of generous donations and strategic friendships, ensured minimal resistance despite the unusual request. The cemetery workers looked uncomfortable, but complied, setting up privacy screens around the fresh grave as curious onlookers gathered at the edges of the property. Margaret stood defiant at the gravesite, a black suit replacing her usual colorful attire, her chin lifted in a gesture of determination that reminded Vincent painfully of Eleanor when she'd made up her mind about something. "She's where she belongs, Vincent. Let her rest. Let her go, finally." "She belongs with me," Vincent hissed, close enough that only Margaret could hear. "You had no right at all." The court order was clear. Under the supervision of law enforcement, cemetery workers carefully unearthed the casket and opened it at the medical examiner's direction. A collective gasp rose from those present. Inside was not Eleanor, but a life-sized porcelain doll dressed in Eleanor's clothes, its glass eyes staring upward with painted serenity, blonde hair arranged in the same style Eleanor had worn for her final portrait. Vincent's face drained of color. "Where is she?" he demanded, turning on Margaret with such violence that an officer stepped between them. "What have you done with her?" Margaret smiled thinly, a cold satisfaction in her eyes. "Where you'll never find her. Perhaps now you can finally begin to grieve properly, Vincent, instead of whatever this obsession has been." The investigation that followed turned Palm Beach society upside down. Rumors circulated about Vincent's mental state, about whether Eleanor had ever been in the solarium at all, about Margaret's possible motivations. The two men who had broken into the mansion were never identified, having disappeared with their payment to a small coastal town in Mexico, where they opened a modest bar that catered to expatriates. What no one knew, not Vincent, not the hired men, not even Margaret, was that the real Eleanor had been cremated years ago, her ashes scattered in the Atlantic as per her actual wishes, documented in a letter she'd left with her attorney to be delivered upon certain conditions. The body in Vincent's solarium had always been an elaborate wax figure, commissioned in secret during Eleanor's final days, as she realized her husband would never let her go, that his obsession had grown beyond love into something possessive and eternal. He bronze Casket, which Vincent kept hidden in a private room accessible only through his personal study, was not empty, as many speculated, nor did it contain a replica. Behind its locked lid, preserved with techniques known only to a specialist Vincent had brought from Eastern Europe at extravagant expense, lay his first wife, whose disappearance 20 years earlier had been ruled a tragic boating accident after a thorough but ultimately misled investigation. Eleanor had discovered the truth months before her death from cancer. She had found the hidden room during Vincent's absence, had seen the face of the woman who had preceded her, had recognized the same possessive preservation that awaited her. Her plan, involving the wax figure, the secret cremation, the letter to her attorney, had been her final act of escape. In the aftermath of the scandal, Vincent withdrew from society, the mansion's curtains permanently drawn. Margaret moved to Arizona, claiming the desert air was better for her health, though many suspected she simply wanted distance from the whispers and sideways glances that followed her through Palm Beach. The only person who knew the complete truth was Eleanor's attorney, who kept his silence out of professional obligation and personal fear. The letter Eleanor had left contained one final instruction: If Vincent ever attempted to claim her body for his collection, certain evidence regarding his first wife's accident should find its way to the authorities. In the end, Eleanor had orchestrated her own freedom from beyond the grave, while the truth about Vincent's past remained buried deeper than any casket could go. And somewhere in the vast Atlantic, her ashes mingled with the eternal currents, carrying her farther and farther from the gilded cage that had been her home and would have been her mausoleum. The bronze casket remained in its hidden room, its occupant forever silent, while Vincent was left to mourn not one, but two women who had escaped his grasp. One through death of her own orchestration, and one through a deception so complete it had fooled even her own sister. His collection, meant to be two, remained at one and would never grow again.